Poetry is extremely unboring to me. I think sweet poetry at events like that really sort of emphasize how unboring poetry is and what it can do that other types of literature or expression or art forms can't. It's like an extremely concentrated form of language. It really tries to do different things with language. It forces you to sit up and listen and pay attention to words you might have heard a million times before, but suddenly they feel totally new.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
we celebrate the LRC's annual Sweet Poetry event with two returning guests, poet and Japanese literature and media scholar Andrew Campana and the LRC's engagement and outreach coordinator, Ashley Griffith.
In Stimson's halls where ideas ignite, a podcast emerges, both bold and bright.
Speaking of Language, its name proclaims a journey through cultures, through words, and through names.
Each week a new voice, a thought to explore, from grammar to proficiency, linguistics, and more.
Professors and poets and learners appear, sharing their insights with humor and cheer.
They speak of the nuance, the tone, and the sound, of meaning and silence, of truth all around.
Of how we connect and how we unite, of language as bridge, as compass, as guide.
Tech tools and teaching, the old and the new, blending tradition with digital view.
The hosts are a compass, they guide with delight, through idioms, syntax, and scripts, left and right.
So here's to the voices that echo and ring, to the joy of the questions, the thoughts that they bring.
To our listeners who tune in from afar and from near, you make us think deeply, and that's why we're here.
So if you seek knowledge or just love a chat, with scholars and dreamers, come pull up a map.
Speaking of Language is more than a show, it's a world of ideas. Press play, let it flow.
April is National Poetry Month, and we felt an ode to our podcast was in order. This is our 207th episode, and we are excited to recap our third annual Sweet Poetry event with our very own Ashley Griffith, and also to catch up with Andrew Campana about his work related to Japanese poetry at the edge of media.
Welcome back to Speaking of Language, Ashley and Andrew.
Hello, thank you.
It's great to be back. It's been a while.
Indeed. So both of you actually have been on the podcast previously, but please briefly remind our listeners what your role is at Cornell. Ashley, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Ashley. I am the Engagement and Outreach Coordinator at the Language Resource Center.
And I'm Andrew Campana. I'm an assistant professor of Japanese literature and media in the Asian Studies Department, and I focus on poetry.
And you're actually a multimedia poet. What does that mean?
I thought it sounded fancy, so I put it in my bio. But,
I like it, yeah.
But what it really means is that, I used to do a lot of performance poetry in both Japan and the U.S., and often I would have, generated text speaking out in a synthesized voice on top of what I was doing and just messing around in different ways. Pretty
Fun.
much.
Very cool.
Yeah, awesome. So, Ashley, last week was the LRC's third annual Sweet Poetry event, and the first time you ran the event. Tell us about Sweet Poetry.
Yeah, so I think the event went very well. It was a great time. Everybody enjoyed it. But Sweet Poetry essentially is just a time for members of the Cornell community to gather, to enjoy fabulous desserts, and to either participate as a reader or an audience member, and to listen to poetry read in multiple world languages. So it was a great time. Everybody enjoyed themselves, I think. And
I think so.
We had an amazing lineup of readers. There were 23 readers that participated this year in 17 different languages.
Cool.
And including a signer, too, right?
Yes, including American Sign Language.
Yeah.
Part of the event as well. Andrew, you actually read a Japanese poem as part of the event. How did you choose your poem, and what is its significance or meaning for you?
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. So I read a poem called The Sounds of Summer, Natsu no Noto by Suzuki Shiroyasu. And I translated it as part of an ongoing project called the Cornell Anthology of Contemporary Poetry, which
cool.
I'm editing with 4 other people. And it's a 500-page monster with 70 different poets.
Wow.
And he's one of them. And so this poem Well, I kind of wanted summer to come, even though it's not going to come anytime soon, it feels like. But I thought it might be appropriate because it's really about the sounds of language. And I feel like when you go to an event like Sweet Poetry with these multilingual poems, like a big part of it is just reveling in the sounds of different languages all coming together in one space. And so this poem was kind of about that, how in the summer you don't just get the sounds of humans, but also nature and frogs and cicadas and everything. So I thought, yeah, let's have a sonic sort of theme this time.
That's awesome. And it was actually surprising to me, Ashley, how many of the poems were about spring.
I know. I think we all kind of are growing weary of the Ithaca weather right now, because there were the German poem was literally titled Der Frühling, Spring. There were a lot of thematic poems, and I did not ask for that at any point from the readers. So yeah, it was fitting.
Absolutely.
In the zeitgeist at the moment.
There we go.
Andrew, your first book, Expanding Verse, Japanese Poetry at the Edge of Media, was published in December 2024.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And it is available open access on the University of California Press website.
Yeah.
So in the book, you examine poems composed at key moments of transition in Japan's media landscape during the past century that interacted with or even pushed back against new media technologies, from cinema to audio recording to YouTube. So what will readers take away from your book?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So what I really want to get at this book is there's this idea that poetry is kind of a thing that's cut off from the world, it's its own thing. Like normally when we learn about poems, it tends to be in, say, a middle school or high school kind of context. And you have to take it very seriously and find what these metaphors mean and maybe memorize something. And I think that's all really good and really important. But the thing is, poetry, what we did in the Sweet Poetry event is a lot closer to what poetry has been over the last several thousand years, right? People coming together and sharing it, it accompanying performance and music and these days screens and food and technology. So with this book, I wanted to sort of explore not just how media of different kinds influence poetry, but how poetry becomes a place or a time or an approach that lets us sort of change spaces, change media, change sound, change image. It provides sort of a special thing that we can do together that makes us rethink whatever's going on at the moment.
So you focus on Japan in the book. How is Japan different from Western contexts when it comes to assumptions about poetry? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I could answer that in a couple of ways. One is that Japan, of course, has its own long traditions of different poetic forms, most famously the haiku, which is an interesting example of a poetic form that pretty much almost everyone across the world knows what it is and how to compose one in elementary school even. It's such an accessible form, right? It's kind of amazing. And so there's this massive history of poetry in Japan, but also in the 19th century, they're like, okay, there's this thing called free verse poetry that people are doing in European languages. How about we try something like that? What would that look like in Japanese? So you had all these poets right from the 1880s onwards just sort of trying to figure out what poetry of that sort would look like in Japanese, and they had to figure it out from scratch. And that's what I like about it. It's that it wasn't this given thing already. They had to really, there's this ongoing process of figuring out what is this new poetry going to look like. And I found that kept going for like decades and decades after. Every decade in Japan, they're like, nah, that old poetry is boring. How about we'll try something like this? And so I find that kind of compressed experimentation is what really stands out in the Japanese context for me.
Interesting.
Was that was understanding that sort of rapid historical evolution, was that what prompted you to start researching and writing this book, or was there something sort of more fundamental than that?
Yeah, to a certain extent. But really, I started at the end of the book, which was about poetry and the internet. And and so my best friend is deaf, and she dragged me to a sign language poetry slam in Boston. And it was like amazing, and I loved it. And then I'm like, does this sort of thing exist in Japan? And of course it does. Yeah, there's tons of Japanese sign language poetry videos online. And I'm like, so I've been studying Japanese literature for like 6 years now at that point, but I've never even heard of this other kind of Japanese literature, Japanese sign language literature, and it's this huge thing online in Japanese deaf communities. So I'm like, so what would it be like to write a history of poetry or literature in Japan where that's as much as part of the canon as the famous poets from the 19th century, like where a Japanese sign language poem on YouTube is equally as important as some of the most famous poems ever written. So that was really, the catalyst for this book for me.
So thinking about poetry in general, why is it important in our current moment? And why are events like Sweet Poetry so impactful?
Yeah, I really like that question because, again, there's this idea of poetry as kind of a moribund form or kind of boring. But what I find is that poetry is extremely unboring to me. Even though I opened the book with an anecdote of while I was researching in Japan, I was on a subway platform and a sort of a drunk couple came up to me and asked, "What are you doing in Japan?" I said, "Oh, I'm studying Japanese literature." They're like, "What kind of literature?" I said, "Modern poetry." And there's this long pause and they said, "That is so boring. You're a boring person." I'm like, no. But it's true. It has this kind of like sort of image and it's hard to get away from. But, I think sweet poetry and events like that really sort of emphasize how unboring poetry is and what it can do that other types of literature or expression or art forms can't. It's like an extremely concentrated form of language.
Yeah.
It really tries to do different things with language. It forces you to sit up and listen and pay attention to words you might have heard a million times before, but suddenly they feel totally new. And at a time like now in which, the language is extremely important and politicized and contested, to go look at poetry, that thing that tries to make language different and fresh and new and relevant to people, I think is more important than ever.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I would say that poetry connects people and the importance of the Sweet Poetry event itself. There were quite a handful of readers who shared original works. And I thought that was just giving them a platform to share something that they put work into, that they cared about. Yeah. And that meant something to them was just beautiful. And being able to share that with others in the community and have a platform to read it was amazing. Especially the student, Angela Chang, I believe was her name, who read a bilingual poem she had written in Mandarin and English about what it means to be bilingual and to seek that understanding of your family and your heritage and your culture. It's powerful to have a space to share that.
Yeah, what was interesting for me was looking across the audience and just seeing how different people took in the poetry in different ways. Right. Like, I distinctly remember there was one student who just sat there with their eyes closed and just literally taking everything in. Yeah. And I think it's, many different ways that you can interact even as the listener or the viewer of a poetry recitation. Yeah, it's a cool event.
Absolutely. And another thing I really like about it is the fact that there's desserts, not just because desserts are great.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I mean, it's in the name, and they're really good desserts. But also, having desserts there gives a signal to the fact that, we're going to take this seriously, but also poetry is a space of fun and pleasure and enjoyment. Right. It's not just this thing that we have to learn and we have to treat reverently.
It's not boring.
It's not boring. It's delightful.
There's nothing boring about cake.
Absolutely. Random drunk couple in Japan. Why is the ability to communicate in another language so important? I'm throwing you a, little narrow question.
Ooh, I love that. That's amazing. And I think poetry, like I said, is a way of making language different, and a way of re-articulating our own relationship to our own language. But learning another language of any kind, it forces you to do that even more. You realize the sort of assumptions that are built into your native language or the languages you grew up in. Or if you learn something like a sign language, the assumptions that all languages have to involve speaking in a certain way, using your mouth and vocal cords, when that also isn't necessary. So learning another language, I think, makes us more aware of how we communicate with others, of course, but also opens up our world in really fundamental ways, I think.
Yeah.
Not much more to add to that other than, languages connect people, and being able to open up your world to connect with even more people it's a powerful thing and something that I wish we had more emphasis on in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amen.
So if you randomly come across Cornell community members and you talk to them about sweet poetry, what would you tell them why they should participate, either as a reader or a signer or just as an audience member?
So for me, Sweet Poetry is a really unique event on campus. You see a cross-section of people that you probably wouldn't see anywhere else. It really underlines how Cornell itself is an extraordinarily international community and always has been. One of the poets I'm talking about who tried to figure out what free verse Japanese poetry should be in the 19th century was a Cornell undergrad, like a botany major, one of the very first from Japan. And so we have this much more than a century-long tradition of Cornell as being a meeting place for people from all over the world. But often you don't really get a sense of that. You don't get to see people speaking in the languages they grew up in or in the many languages they're learning on campus. So to see all of that happen in such a concentrated way is unlike anything I've ever seen on campus, really.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I also think that just the ability to hear languages spoken that you might not hear normally. Like this year, there were a handful of languages that I was really happy to have represented at the event. We had a reader share a poem in Icelandic, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I've never heard Icelandic spoken before. It was so cool. So just being able to give a platform for Cornell community members to share their art and their language, even if it's not a language that's offered for study here. I think that that's a reason in itself to come, and also cake.
And also cake.
Absolutely. Can't overstate that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what's up on the horizon for each of you? Any new projects or anything else coming up you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is that this fall, if undergrads are listening, I am teaching my Japanese poetry class again. And
nice.
I'm definitely going to take an expansive, weird approach to it. And I'm going to force you to write your own poems every week in response to the Japanese poems we're reading. So
that's awesome.
It's always been fun. So I hope some of you check it out. And the other is the thing I mentioned, the Cornell Anthology of Contemporary Japanese Poetry. I think it's Japanese contemporary poetry. To have a bunch of it available in English will make it more teachable and more accessible. So definitely, keep your eye on the news from Cornell University Press about that, because it might come across your desk in the next few years.
Awesome. Well, and aren't you also working on a second book?
Oh, gosh. Yes, I am. So that one is tentatively called Glitch Text, Digital Poetics in Japan. And it's kind of about taking what I did in the first book and really focusing on the 21st century and how computation and video games especially sort of have influenced how poetry has been written in Japan and vice versa.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, now that Sweet Poetry is a wrap, sights are set on our fall event, World Languages Day. Podcast listeners will know that I spoke about that on a previous episode as well. But that's just another event to bring people to campus, specifically middle and high school students from the area, to expose them to world languages and give them an opportunity to be on a college campus, experience all of the linguistic opportunities that we have here and that they might have at other college campuses. And
Great.
Awesome. Well, we enjoyed talking poetry and desserts with both of you. Before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share a word in a language that you love, you are learning, you want to learn, that makes you feel good. What comes to mind?
Ooh, I like this question. Okay. The word I'm going to go with is a Japanese word, which is zuzushi, which means shameless or brazen or impudent or cheeky.
It sounds like that.
Yeah, it's fun to say. And, it's an ancient word, but I first came across it. I was watching, for some reason, the Japanese dub of Clueless, the movie from the 90s.
oh my gosh.
And she was talking about, like, the college boys. I was like, they're so zuzushi. I'm like, ooh, that's such a delicious word to sort of put someone in their place. So,
That Paul Rudd,
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. Amazing.
That's awesome.
Well, for me, in my Spanish self-study right now, I am on house vocabulary, and I just really like sala, the word for living room.
Nice.
Short, sweet, simple, a
Yeah.
place I like to spend my time in.
Yes. I hear that.
Yeah, the English phrase is so sort of long and
Right.
obvious in comparison, but sala, that's
Sala.
perfect.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Ashley and Andrew.
Thank you.
Next week, we hear all about the Cornell Migrations Program with its director, Dr. Katie Fiorella, Associate Professor in the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health in Cornell's College of Veterinary Medicine.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kraemer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.